A broken guardian. The wind howled across the barren wasteland of Xiphon, a forgotten planet at the edge of the galaxy. The sky was a dull shade of gray, and the ground was cracked and lifeless. Nothing moved, except for the weak, flickering lights of a fallen warrior. Xal'Ran, once a powerful protector of the Velari Empire, lay motionless among the ruins of an old battlefield. His metallic body was covered in dust, his armor dented and broken. Deep scars from plasma blasts and energy swords marked his once mighty form. His power core flickered weakly, struggling to keep him alive. For years, he had waited. For rescue. For death. For anything. But no one came. His creators had abandoned him. His enemies had left him to rust. He was nothing more than a useless, broken machine. Then, something changed. A faint beeping sound echoed through the air, a distress signal. It wasn't his. Someone else was here, a stranger from the stars. Jake Carter groaned as he crawled out of the wreckage of his ship. Smoke rose from the twisted metal, and sparks flew from exposed wires. He had crash-landed, and the damage was bad. "Damn it," he muttered, kicking a broken panel. "That's the last time I take a shortcut through an asteroid field." Jake was a human engineer, a fixer, a tinkerer. He had spent most of his life repairing broken machines, but this time he was the one stranded. His radio was dead, his food supplies were low, and the planet around him looked completely uninhabitable. He pulled his backpack over his shoulder and started walking. If he stayed near the ship, he would die. He needed to find shelter, water, maybe even a way to send a distress signal. Hours passed. The wasteland stretched endlessly in every direction. But then, something caught his eye. A huge metallic figure half buried in the sand. At first, Jake thought it was just another wrecked ship. But as he got closer, he realized it was something else. A robot? A mech? No, an alien warrior. A warrior left to die. Xal'Ran's sensors detected movement. He forced his one remaining red eye to focus. A human. Strange. Humans weren't supposed to be here. The figure approached carefully, eyes wide with curiosity. "Whoa," Jake whispered, stepping closer. "You're still alive." Xal'Ran's voice was weak, static-filled. "Leave me. I am broken." Jake frowned. He had seen plenty of machines in his time, but never anything like this. A living machine. A biomechanical warrior. His engineer instincts kicked in. "You're not dead yet," Jake said, kneeling beside him. He ran his fingers over the damaged metal, inspecting the wires, the circuits, the power core. Just a little. Beat up. Xal'Ran's red eye flickered. "I am useless." "No. Honor remains." Jake snorted. "Honor? Buddy, I don't care about that. I care about fixing things." He pulled out a small toolkit from his backpack. Wires sparked as he examined the warrior's damaged circuits. The armor was tough, but beneath it, the technology was surprisingly advanced. If he could just reconnect some of the broken systems. Xal'Ran was too weak to stop him. He simply watched as the humans started repairing him. A spark of life. The first thing Jake did was bypass the energy drain in Xal'Ran's core. The protector had been stuck in a low-power mode, barely staying alive. As soon as the connection was restored, a pulse of energy surged through Xal'Ran's body. His fingers twitched. His vision cleared. His strength began to return. Xal'Ran gasped as power flowed back into his limbs. "You repaired me." Jake grinned, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Told you. I fixed things." For the first time in years, Xal'Ran sat up. His heavy body shifted, gears groaning as they moved for the first time in a long time. Dust fell from his armor, revealing the warrior beneath. Xal'Ran stared at the human in silence. No one had ever done this for him. No one had ever seen him as something worth saving. "Why?" he finally asked. Jake shrugged. Because I don't like seeing good tech go to waste. Danger in the distance. For a moment, there was peace. The warrior had been revived. The human had found something valuable. A protector, a possible ally. But then, a shadow moved in the distance. Zal-Ran's sensors picked it up first. He turned his head sharply, scanning the horizon. We are not alone. Jake followed his gaze. He saw figures, barely visible against the gray sky. They were watching. Friends of yours? Jake asked, suddenly uneasy. No, Zal-Ran said, his voice now stronger. Enemies. Jake's stomach tightened. He didn't know who they were, but something in Zal-Ran's voice sent a shiver down his spine. Then we better get moving, Jake said. Can you walk? Zal-Ran planted his massive hands into the dirt and pushed himself up. He swayed for a moment, then steadied himself. I can fight. Jake looked at him, then back at the approaching figures. He let out a nervous laugh. Well, that's good, he said, because I think we're gonna need it. The repair that changed everything. The cold wind of HFY howled through the wasteland, carrying the scent of rust, decay, and forgotten battles. The sky remained an endless stretch of gray, the kind that crushed hope and swallowed dreams. But beneath it, something impossible was happening. A dead warrior was coming back to life. Zal-Ran, a protector of the long-fallen Velari Empire, had been broken, abandoned, left to rust. His powerful body, once feared across the galaxy, had been reduced to a crippled shell, barely functioning, his power core dim and weak. Until now, a human, a fragile, unarmored, insignificant human, was fixing him. A human's hands on an alien warrior. Jake Carter wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. He was a fixer. His hands weren't made for battle. They were made for wires, circuits, and broken things. And right now, he was elbow-deep in the mechanical insides of an alien warrior. A spark flew as he twisted two exposed cables together. The pulse of energy sent a brief shudder through Zal-Ran's massive frame. The warrior's damaged red eye flickered once, then again. Jake grinned. There we go. I think I found the problem. Zal-Ran's voice was rough, like metal grinding against metal. You? Restore me. Yeah, don't sound so surprised. Jake wiped sweat from his forehead. You were running on backup power, and your core was stuck in a shutdown loop. I bypassed it, so now you're getting a steady flow of energy again. Zal-Ran processed the words. No one, not his own kind, not his creators, not his enemies, had ever done this for him. You waste effort, Zal-Ran muttered. I am obsolete, useless. Jake snorted. Yeah, well, I don't believe in useless things. Everything can be fixed. He twisted another bolt into place. Zal-Ran's fingers twitched. Then, his hand moved. The first movement in years. The warrior's massive arm lifted slightly from the ground. His fingers flexing, his servos humming weakly. It wasn't much, but for the first time in decades, he was functional. Zal-Ran's red eye flickered to life. I feel strength returning. Yeah, don't get too excited, Jake muttered. You're still a wreck. But inside, he was amazed. He had never worked on alien tech like this before. Zal-Ran wasn't just metal and circuits. There was something more. His systems thought. His processors weren't just computing data. They were feeling. Jake had no idea what he had just woken up. But Zal-Ran did, and he owed the human for it. Memories of a lost war. For the first time in years, Zal-Ran's memory core rebooted. He remembered. The Velari Empire had been the greatest force in the galaxy. Zal-Ran had been one of its elite guardians, created to protect, to serve, to fight. But war had consumed his people. The empire had collapsed, and its warriors had been abandoned, discarded like broken weapons. He had fallen here, on HFY, in one final battle. And then, nothing. Darkness. Silence. Isolation. Until now. Until this human engineer had put his hands on a forgotten relic and decided it was worth saving. Zal-Ran turned his red gaze toward Jake. "Human," he said slowly. "Why do this?" Jake barely looked up from his work. "Because you're still breathing. And if something's still breathing, it can still fight. A warrior's promise." Zal-Ran sat up fully, his frame groaning in protest, but his power growing stronger. His armored plating still had deep cracks, his servos still stiff, but for the first time in a long time, he felt alive. Jake leaned back, arms crossed. "Not bad for a first try. Think you can stand?" Zal-Ran pressed his massive hands into the ground. Sand shifted as his enormous form rose inch by inch, his systems whining in resistance. But he stood, towering, unyielding. He looked down at the small human, the one who had done what no alien had bothered to do: restore him. "Your hands have given me new life," Zal-Ran said, his deep voice vibrating through the air. "By my code, I am bound to you." Jake blinked. "Huh. You repaired me," Zal-Ran said. "Now I shall protect you." Jake's face twisted in confusion. "That's not how this works, man. You saved me," Zal-Ran interrupted. "Now I am yours to command." Jake let out a nervous laugh. "I didn't sign up for this." But Zal-Ran's red eyes burned with certainty. "I have spoken." The first test. Before Jake could argue further, something shifted in the distance. Zal-Ran's sensors detected it first. His head snapped toward the horizon. His war instincts kicked in. Danger. Jake followed his gaze. There, just beyond the ruins, a group of figures was approaching. Dark, slinking shapes. Watching. Friends of yours?" Jake asked. "No," Zal-Ran said, his voice now filled with strength. "They are scavengers. Raiders. Killers." Jake's stomach tightened. He could feel the wrongness in the air. "Great," he muttered. "Because nothing's ever easy, right?" Zal-Ran clenched his fists. For the first time in years, he had power in his limbs. He had purpose, and the first thing he would do with his new life: defend the human who had given it back to him. A new threat rises. The air of Xiphon-9 felt different now. It was no longer just a dead world full of ruins and dust. Something had awakened. A broken protector had risen from the grave. A human engineer had done the impossible. And now, unseen eyes watched from the distance, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Footsteps in the dust. Jake Carter wiped sweat from his forehead as he stepped back, looking up, way up, at the towering form of Zal-Ran. The alien warrior was still dented, still scared from battles long past. But now he stood. His joints groaned, his metal plates scraped together, but his core burned with new power. "Okay," Jake said, catching his breath. "You're up and moving. That's good." Zal-Ran turned his head, red optics flickering. "Your repairs have given me strength." Jake smirked. "Yeah, well, don't get too excited. You still look like you lost a fight with a space bulldozer." But before Zal-Ran could reply, he suddenly stiffened. Jake noticed it immediately. The shift in body language, the tension. You good?" Jake asked. Zal-Ran didn't answer. He scanned the horizon, his advanced sensors kicking in now that he had regained some power. And what he found made his core burn hot with warning. "We are being watched." Jake's stomach dropped. "Watched?" he echoed. Then he heard it. The crunch of footsteps, the subtle sound of metal scraping against metal. And suddenly, from the ruins of the battlefield, shadows moved. The scavengers of Xiphon-9. They emerged from the wreckage like ghosts, tall, armored figures, their bodies covered in crude metal plating, their faces hidden behind cracked visors. There were 5 at first, then 7, then more. They carried scavenged weapons, rusted plasma rifles, energy blades, and even the remains of ancient tech stripped from dead machines. And they were looking directly at Sauron. Jake swallowed hard. Yeah, I don't like this. Zalran's deep voice rumbled like distant thunder. They are raiders, scavengers, killers of the weak. The lead raider, a tall, jagged figure, stepped forward. His voice was like oil, slick and full of mockery. Well, the raider leader sneered. I never thought I'd see the legendary Sauron standing again. Jake blinked. Wait, you know him. The raider's visor turned toward Jake, and the way he stared sent a shiver down Jake's spine. Oh, we know him, the raider said. Everyone knows the Forsaken Protector. He was left behind after the war. They say he's been rotting here for decades. Jake frowned. Yeah, well, he's not rotting anymore. The raider chuckled. Indeed, and that makes things interesting. You see, his body, his core, his weapons, they're worth a fortune. Jake tensed. Yeah, I don't think we're selling. The raider's grin widened. Oh, we weren't asking. Then, they attacked. The first battle. The first plasma shot cracked through the air like lightning. Jake barely had time to react before Sauron moved with inhuman speed, shoving him aside as the shot slammed into his armored chest. The impact burned, but Sauron did not fall. Instead, he growled. A cowardly strike. Jake scrambled to his feet, heart pounding. Yeah, welcome to my life. The scavengers rushed forward, weapons raised. Jake ducked behind a piece of wreckage as Sauron charged. The Protector moved like a storm of metal and rage. His massive arms swung. One scavenger was sent flying, slamming into a ruined wall. Another came at him with a plasma blade, but Sauron caught the weapon mid-swing, his hand burning, and ripped it from the attacker's grasp before driving a fist into their chest. Jake peeked over the wreckage, eyes wide. Okay, yeah, he's terrifying. But even as Sauron tore through them, Jake realized something. There were too many. They were surrounding him, keeping their distance, taking calculated shots to weaken him. And Sauron was not fully repaired. He was strong, but he was not invincible. Jake's brain worked on instinct. If Sauron went down, they were both dead. So he did something incredibly stupid. He grabbed a rusted energy rifle from the ground, aimed, and fired. A human in the fight. The shot was terrible. The gun kicked back hard, nearly knocking Jake over. But it hit one of the scavengers. The raiders staggered, their armor sparking. For a moment, the entire battlefield froze. Sauron turned his head slightly, surprised. The scavenger leader's visor locked onto Jake. The human fights, the raider mused. Then his voice turned cold. Kill him first. Jake's heart stopped. Oh, crap. The scavengers turned their weapons on him. Plasma bolts burned through the air. And then, Sauron roared. It wasn't a normal roar. It was a war cry, deep and ancient, a sound that shook the ground and sent a chill down even the raiders' spines. And then he moved, faster than before, stronger, more violent. A Protector awakened. He grabbed one scavenger and crushed their weapon in his fist. Another he slammed into the dirt, sending a shockwave through the ground. Jake had never seen anything like it. Sauron wasn't just fighting. He was protecting. Because that was what he had been created for. Because he had made a vow. Because Jake Carter had repaired him, and now he would defend him. No matter the cost. The aftermath. The scavengers fled. Those who survived ran into the ruins, vanishing into the shadows. Sauron stood in the silence, his armored body smoking from the fight, his optics glowing bright. Jake, still breathing hard, looked up at him. That was insane. Sauron looked down. They will return. Jake groaned. Great. Love that. Sauron turned toward the horizon. His optics scanned the darkness. And then he said something that made Jake's stomach twist. The distress signal was sent. Jake frowned. What distress signal? Zalran's red eyes burned. Before they fell, the scavengers called for reinforcements. Jake's breath caught in his throat. How many? He asked. Zalran looked toward the sky. An army. The battle for survival. The night sky above HFY was vast and endless, stretching over the ruined battlefield like a dark, suffocating blanket. It had been quiet for years, a graveyard of metal and dust, a place where forgotten warriors rusted away. But tonight, that silence was broken. Tonight, something long dead had risen again. And now, an army was coming to put it back in the grave. A moment of dread. Jake Carter ran a hand through his hair, breathing heavily. His legs still shook from the fight, adrenaline pumping through his veins. The scavengers had fled, but the battle wasn't over. Zalran stood beside him, towering and unshaken. His massive frame was still scared, dented, and worn, but his stance was that of a warrior ready for war. Jake swallowed hard. You said they sent a distress signal. Zalran's red optics burned. Yes. More will come. Jake's stomach tightened. How many are we talking about here? A handful. A dozen. Zalran didn't look at him. Instead, he stared toward the horizon. Then he said a single word. Hundreds. Jake froze. I don't like that number. Zalran's voice was calm but grim. They will come in waves. Heavily armed. They will not leave survivors. Jake rubbed his temples, his mind racing. Okay. We need a plan. Running is out of the question, I assume. They will track us. Jake sighed. Of course they will. Zalran tightened his fists. The fight had been a test, and he had passed. But just barely. He was not yet at full strength. The scavengers had been careful, hitting him in his weakest spots, avoiding direct fights. They had known what they were doing. And now, their masters were coming to finish the job. The sky burns. Jake turned toward the wreckage of his ship. It was still a smoking ruin, its communications fried, weapons offline. His only chance of getting out of here was fixing it. But there was no time. Then the sky lit up. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Tell me that's not what I think it is. Zalran did not move. Their ships have arrived. A deep, thunderous roar filled the air. 3 black ships broke through the clouds, their engines burning red, their shapes sharp and deadly. They weren't here for salvage. They were here to kill. Jake's throat went dry. We're so screwed. A desperate defense. The first ship dropped low, its side panels opening, deploying raiders in heavy armor. The second ship positioned itself above, its plasma cannons charging. The third remained at a distance, likely the command ship, watching. Jake took a step back. Okay, yeah, this is not a fair fight. Zalran didn't hesitate. He moved. Get behind cover, he ordered. Jake didn't argue. He dove behind the wreckage of an old Velari war machine, gripping the rusted metal as the first shots exploded around them. Zalran charged forward, taking a direct hit to the shoulder. His armor burned, but he did not stop. The first wave of raiders hit the ground, weapons raised. They spread out in a circle, coordinated, precise. These weren't just scavengers. These were mercenaries. Jake realized something horrible. They weren't here for Zalran's body. They were here because they were hired. Someone wanted him dead. And now, Jake was in the middle of it. A monster unleashed. Zalran didn't wait. He lunged, faster than his massive size should have allowed. The first raider didn't even have time to scream before a massive fist caved in his armor, sending him flying into the wreckage. The second swung a plasma blade. Zalran caught it with his bare hand. The energy burned his palm, but he ripped the weapon free, slamming the attacker into the ground. A plasma shot hit him in the side. He staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, he turned, eyes blazing, and hurled a broken metal beam at the shooter. It impaled them instantly. Jake watched in stunned silence. Zalran wasn't just fighting. He was destroying them. But for every mercenary that fell, 2 more took their place, and the second ship's cannons were almost fully charged. The engineer's gamble. Jake's mind raced. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a fighter. But he was an engineer, and that meant he saw patterns. He scanned the battlefield. The mercenaries were focused on Zalran. They saw him as the biggest threat, which meant they weren't watching Jake. And that was a mistake. His eyes locked onto something nearby. An old power core, partially buried in the dirt. A Velari war relic, still active. His hands moved before his brain even finished processing the idea. He grabbed a toolkit, sprinting through the wreckage. Plasma bolts whizzed past him, but no one had noticed him yet. Jake slid behind the power core, fingers flying across the ancient controls. If this thing still worked, if he could reroute the charge. Boom! The second ship fired its cannons, targeting Zalran. Zalran barely dodged, the explosion sending him crashing into the ground. Smoke and dust filled the air. Jake's heart pounded. No time left. He twisted a final wire, gritted his teeth, and flipped the switch. The sky burns again. A massive energy pulse surged through the battlefield. The buried Velari war core came back to life in an instant, sending out a shockwave of raw power. And then, the sky exploded. The second ship was hit directly in the engines, flames bursting from its side as it spiraled out of control. The first ship was caught in the blast radius, sending mercenaries flying like ragdolls. Jake ducked as fire and metal rained from above. Then silence. When the dust settled, Zalran rose from the rubble, his red eyes glowing brighter than ever. Jake staggered to his feet, panting. Zalran turned to him. "You did this." Jake grinned, wiping blood from his lip. "Told you. I fix things." Zalran let out something that might have been a chuckle. But before they could celebrate, a new sound filled the air. A deep mechanical voice. A transmission. "This is Commander Trelvik. We have lost 2 ships, deploying the final assault." Jake's face fell. Zalran clenched his fists. "They will not stop." Jake exhaled sharply. "Then neither will we." The final battle was about to begin. A warrior's oath. The battlefield was a graveyard of fire and metal. The sky above HFY 9 was thick with smoke, the ground littered with the wreckage of fallen ships and bodies of defeated mercenaries. Sparks flew from twisted hulls, and the distant sound of crackling flames filled the air. Jake Carter's hands were shaking, his breathing ragged. He had survived so far, but only barely. And now, the real fight was about to begin. Zalran stood beside him, tall and unshaken, his glowing red optics locked onto the sky. His armor was dented and burned, his body worn down from the relentless battle. But he had not fallen. He would not fall, because he had made a vow. And Zalran never broke his vows. A deadly arrival. A deep rumbling shook the ground beneath them. Jake staggered, gripping onto a piece of wreckage for support. His eyes darted to the horizon. A new ship was descending, much larger than the ones before. Its black hull was lined with spiked plating, and its engines roared like an animal unleashed from its cage. But the worst part, it wasn't coming alone. Behind it, dozens of smaller ships followed, moving like a swarm of locusts, circling the sky like vultures. Jake swallowed hard. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." Zalran's voice was like a distant storm. "It is their commander." Jake clenched his fists. Commander of what, exactly? The Zalran turned his glowing optics toward Jake. The ironclad hunters. Jake had never heard of them before. But the way Zalran said the name, like it was carved into his memory, like it was something he had feared in another life, made Jake's stomach twist. The main ship touched down, its engines kicking up a whirlwind of dust. From the smoke, a figure emerged. Tall, heavy armored, a walking fortress of steel. Commander Trelvik. His battle-worn helmet was scarred from 100 fights, and his voice carried the weight of death itself. The alien warrior didn't move. Trelvik. The commander laughed coldly. I never thought I'd see you standing again. You should have rusted where we left you. Jake, still catching his breath, muttered, Yeah, you guys keep saying that. I think we've made it pretty clear. He's not rusting anytime soon. Trelvik shifted his gaze to Jake, as if noticing him for the first time. And what is this? A human? A weakling? Is this what saved you, Xalaran? Xalran's body tensed. His fingers curled into fists. Jake smirked. Saved him? Nah. He saved me. And now, I think he's about to save me again. Trelvik's amused expression vanished. He raised his gauntleted hand, and the sky screamed with the sound of energy weapons powering up. Kill them both. The final stand begins. The battle erupted instantly. The first wave of soldiers surged forward, their weapons blazing. Energy blasts streaked through the air, cutting through the dust and debris. Xalran charged into them like a living war machine. His first strike sent 3 warriors flying, their armor crushed under his sheer power. He ripped the weapon from one of their hands and turned it against them, firing a plasma bolt straight through their chest plates. Jake, meanwhile, did what he did best: think fast. He dove behind cover, eyes scanning the wreckage. He needed an advantage, something to tip the scales in their favor. And then he saw it. Half buried in the sand was a Velari anti-air turret, its barrel covered in rust, its controls flickering weakly. Jake's eyes lit up. Oh, hell yes. While Xalaran fought, Jake sprinted across the battlefield, dodging plasma shots as he slid behind the old turret's controls. His fingers flew across the ancient interface, trying to force it online. Come on, come on. A mercenary spotted him. Jake barely had time to react before a blade whistled toward his head. Bang! The mercenary's head snapped back, a hole burned straight through his visor. Jake turned just in time to see Xalran lowered his stolen weapon, smoke still trailing from the barrel. Work faster, human. Jake grinned. On it. With a final click, the turret roared to life. The battlefield turns. Jake didn't hesitate. He swung the massive gun toward the sky, aiming at the swarm of incoming ships. His hands tightened on the controls. And then, he fired. The explosive rounds tore through the air, hitting 2 enemy ships instantly. They spun out of control, crashing into each other before detonating in a fiery explosion. More ships swerved to avoid the wreckage, but Jake was already aiming again. Boom, boom, boom. Ship after ship fell, their metal husks crashing into the ground. The battlefield erupted into chaos. Xalran fought like a beast unleashed, breaking through their front lines, tearing through enemies like they were nothing. He was no longer just a machine. He was a force of nature, a living storm of rage and vengeance. Trelvik watched from the distance, his fist tightening. He had come to end Xalran. Now he realized Xalran had only just begun. A protector's promise. The battle raged on, but it was changing. The mercenaries, once confident, once laughing, were now panicking. Their ships were falling. Their forces were breaking apart. Xalran ripped through the last of them, stepping over fallen bodies as the smoke cleared. Jake, still gripping the turret controls, exhaled sharply. Tell me we won. Xalran stepped forward, his towering form blocking out the burning sky. We won. Jake laughed breathlessly, rubbing his face. Oh, thank God. But Xalran wasn't looking at the battlefield anymore. He was looking at Jake, the human who had restored him, who had believed in him when no one else had. And then, the great warrior of the Velari Empire, once abandoned, once forgotten, did something no one could have expected. He knelt. Jake froze. What are you doing?" Zalran's voice rumbled like thunder, filled with absolute conviction. "You gave me life again. You stood beside me when no others would. And now, by my oath, my code, I swear to you, I will protect you until my final breath." Jake stared at him, stunned. "Well," he finally muttered, "that's a lot." Zalran rose to his full height, his red eyes burning like twin suns. "The galaxy is dangerous, Jake Carter." Jake sighed, adjusting his jacket. "Yeah, I'm getting that." Zalran's optics gleamed. "Then let us face it together. A galaxy against them." The sky above Xiphon 9 still burned. Wreckage lay scattered across the battlefield. Shattered ships, broken weapons, and the remains of mercenaries who had underestimated the forgotten warrior. Smoke curled upward, carrying the scent of scorched metal and burnt ozone. The battle was over. For now. Jake Carter leaned against a twisted chunk of debris, his arms crossed, his breath still uneven from the chaos. His hands were cut, his clothes were singed, but he was alive. Beside him, Zalran stood tall, his red optics scanning the battlefield, ensuring no threats remained. His armor was dented, his plating still scarred from battle, but his stance was unshaken. He had survived worse. But Jake knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The truth behind the attack. Jake exhaled, rubbing his face. "Okay, so we didn't die. That's good." Zalran turned his glowing gaze toward the human. "Survival is only the first step." Jake sighed. "Yeah, I figured you were gonna say something dramatic like that." He glanced at the wreckage around them. The mercenaries hadn't just attacked blindly. They had been organized, well-equipped. And their leader, Commander Trelvik, had called them ironclad hunters. Jake frowned. So, who exactly were these guys? Zalran's fingers clenched into fists. They were not just scavengers. They were sent. Jake's eyes narrowed. Sent by who? Zalran was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and full of weight. "By the ones who fear me." Jake didn't like the sound of that. Zalran turned his gaze toward the horizon. The Velari Empire fell long ago. But those who destroyed it, they still rule. Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. "And they just found out you're still alive." Zalran nodded. "And now, they will come." Jake groaned, rubbing his temples. Of course they will. He had crash-landed on a desolate planet, found a forgotten alien warrior, helped fix him up. And now the galaxy wanted them both dead. Just another Tuesday. A warship on the horizon. A sudden blip on Zalran's sensors made him tense instantly. Jake noticed the change in his body language. "What? What is it?" Zalran didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze skyward. Jake followed his eyes. Then his stomach dropped. A ship had appeared in the distance, a dark silhouette against the burning clouds. Not just any ship. A warship. Massive. Armored. Bristling with heavy weapons. Jake's heart pounded. We just took down an army, man. I'm not sure we can handle a whole damn warship." Zalran's optics burned brighter. "It is not here to attack." Jake blinked. "What?" Zalran stared at the warship, calculating. Then he turned to Jake. "It is here to observe. A warning from the stars." The warship hovered over the ruins, its engines humming like a beast watching its prey. Then, a signal came through. A voice, deep and mechanical, crackled through the air. Zalran, the last guardian. Jake felt his blood turn cold. Zalran did not react. "Speak your message." The voice continued. "The High Order knows you live. You were meant to be forgotten. Yet here you stand." Jake muttered under his breath. "Wow. Love the friendly welcome." The voice ignored him. "You are a relic of a dead empire, a threat to the balance of power. You should have remained buried in the sands of Xiphon 9. Zalran stood firm. I do not answer to the high order. The warship's weapons primed, but did not fire. It was a warning, a display of power. You have been marked. From this day forward, you will be hunted, not just by mercenaries, but by entire fleets. Jake's pulse spiked. Oh, that's just fantastic. The voice grew darker. And the human, he is now marked as well. Jake groaned, running a hand through his hair. Okay, cool. So I'm officially on the kill-on-sight list. Great, just what I needed. The warship lingered for a moment, then slowly turned, its thrusters blazing as it vanished into the clouds. Jake let out a long breath. Okay, so that's bad, right? Zalran's fists clenched. It means we cannot run. Jake frowned. What do you mean? The warrior turned toward him. They will hunt us across the stars. Jake crossed his arms. So what do we do? Zalran's red optics burned brighter than before. We fight. The strategy of a survivor. Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, I love the whole warrior vengeance thing you got going on. But let's be real. One giant alien and one human with a toolbox aren't gonna win a war. Zalran tilted his head. Wars are not won with numbers. They are won with strategy. Jake raised an eyebrow. You got a plan. The warrior's expression was unreadable. We do not need to destroy the high order. Jake waited. Go on. Zalran's gaze was steady. We only need to make the galaxy realize they are not as strong as they pretend to be. Jake's mind clicked into place. You're saying, we make them afraid. Zalran nodded. Yes, a single warrior can change the fate of empires, but only if the right story is told. Jake grinned. You're talking about building a legend. Zalran's massive form seemed to radiate power. You woke me from my grave. Jake Carter. Now let us remind the galaxy why they once feared my name. Jake chuckled. All right then. Let's give them something to be scared of. A journey begins. They had no fleet, no army, no allies, just a human engineer and a forgotten warrior. But together, they were about to shake the entire damn galaxy. The ultimate stand. The starfield above them was a brilliant tapestry of light and shadow. The wreckage of the past battles had been left behind, but the memory of them lingered like the acrid smoke that clung to Jake Carter's clothes. Every step forward brought them closer to their new mission, and closer to the enemies who would stop at nothing to ensure they failed. Zalran stood motionless at the edge of the canyon, his red optics scanning the horizon. The jagged cliffs below framed the ancient ruins of what once might have been a Velari outpost, now reduced to crumbling stone and faded glyphs. This was their destination, the forgotten vault where Zalran believed they could find what they needed to take on the high order. Jake adjusted the makeshift pack on his shoulder, its weight heavy with spare tools and salvaged tech. You're sure about this? He asked. This vault's not gonna be another empty tomb. Zalran didn't turn. It is not empty. I can feel it. Jake sighed. Yeah, well, I felt pretty confident I wouldn't crash land on this planet, but look how that turned out. Zalran's optics glowed slightly brighter. You doubt my instincts. Jake raised his hands in mock surrender. Not at all, big guy. Just hoping you're right. Zalran began to descend the rocky slope. Follow. We have little time. A guardian's legacy. The entrance to the vault was massive, carved into the stone like the mouth of a great beast. Ancient Velari symbols lined the archway, their meaning long since lost to history. Jake set his pack down and began rummaging through his tools. If this thing's been sealed up for as long as you say, it's probably not gonna open with a friendly knock. Zalran approached the door, his massive hand brushing against the glyphs. It will open. It recognizes its own. Jake raised an eyebrow. It recognizes you. I was built by the Velari. This was once a sanctuary for my kind. Jake hesitated. Sanctuary or armory? Zalran's optics turned toward him. Does it matter? Jake shrugged. Fair point. Zalran placed both hands against the door. A faint hum resonated through the air, and the ancient metal began to glow faintly. Lines of light traced the surface of the glyphs, pulsing and spreading until the door shuddered. With a deep, grinding noise, the massive barrier slid open. Behind it, the interior of the vault was a labyrinth of technology and shadow. Jake stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the forgotten weapons, the cracked data terminals, the rows of stasis chambers that lined the walls. This, Jake trailed off. This is a freaking gold mine. Zalran didn't respond. His attention was locked on a pedestal in the center of the room. Upon it rested a small glowing crystal, suspended in a field of energy. Jake moved closer, his curiosity outweighing his caution. What is that? The heart of Aegis, Zalran said, his voice lower than usual. It is what will bring balance to my systems, and perhaps the edge we need. Jake frowned. The edge against what? Zalran turned to him. Against the High Order's fleets, against their champions, against their fear. An old enemy returns. As Jake reached into his pack for a scanning tool, his hand froze mid-motion. His ears caught something faint, the hum of engines. Are you hearing that? Jake asked, looking up at Zalran. Zalran's optics dimmed slightly as he focused. Then, without a word, he turned and began to move toward the vault's entrance. Jake scrambled after him. What is it? More scavengers? No, Zalran said grimly. It is him. Jake's stomach dropped. Him, you mean? They emerged from the vault's mouth just in time to see the skies above the canyon darken as a massive warship descended. Smaller vessels accompanied it, darting through the clouds like predators circling their prey. And at the forefront, on the lead ship's bridge, Commander Trelvik stood with his arms crossed, his voice booming through the ship's external speakers. Zalran, the last guardian, the one who refused to die. Jake cursed under his breath. This guy again. Zalran stepped forward, his massive frame outlined against the canyon's edge. You return, Trelvik. Did you not learn from our last encounter? Trelvik's laughter was cold. Oh, I learned. That's why I brought more firepower. Jake glanced nervously at Zalran. You got a plan for this, buddy? Zalran's red optics glowed brightly. Yes, I fight. Jake threw up his hands. Great plan. Fantastic plan. Really thought that one through. The final fight. The first barrage came from above. Plasma bolts rained down, tearing into the canyon walls. Explosions rocked the ground, and Jake barely managed to throw himself behind a boulder as debris flew in all directions. Zalran didn't flinch. He charged into the chaos, his massive fists pounding into the ground and sending shockwaves through the earth. He ripped a piece of fallen wreckage from the ground and hurled it into the sky, striking one of the smaller vessels and sending it spiraling out of control. Jake peeked out from his cover, watching as Zalran engaged the enemy forces head-on. The warrior moved with precision and ferocity, his strikes calculated and devastating. Each blow sent mercenaries flying. Each leap closed the gap between him and the enemy's front line. But the warship's cannons continued to fire, and even Zalran couldn't avoid them all.